A pleasure to have Paul Avey, and Paul, you can give us the title of your book as well, and take it away from me.
Well, thank you, Francois, and let me thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's a privilege to be here today, and thank everyone for coming out on what at least looks like a nice Friday afternoon, when I'm sure there's a number of other pleasant things you could be doing on that. So the book is called Tempting Fates, Why Non-Nuclear States Confront Nuclear Opponents. I should probably be able to know the title without reading it off the book cover, but there it is. I was going to make a joke about the Valentine's Day gift. It's written down, and then right before it comes there, it's done. But it is available. The ebook version is available free, thanks to Virginia Tech's participation in the program toward an open monograph ecosystem. So if anyone wants to go download it, you don't have to spend a dime to do so. But a hard copy does look nicer. So what I want to do today is just take a few minutes to go over sort of the origins of the project, what are some of the core arguments, a little bit of the evidence, and then just conclude with some final thoughts. And I'm happy to talk more about any or all of these issues during discussion. And I'll begin with the observation. I think it's important when you start out talking about nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy, nuclear politics, that these are terrible weapons. They've only been used in warfare twice, and in that case, estimates vary, but somewhere between 105,000 and 200,000 people were killed. And you can certainly attribute additional direct and indirect deaths to these weapons over the course of the nuclear era. The sort of best you can say in defense of them is they hold out the promise of peace through the prospect of devastation, which is certainly a dangerous bargain, but one that countries have seemed to accept for the last 70 years. And I did not set out to study nuclear weapons when I began my career. I was not directly interested in nuclear politics. The disruptiveness meant that they come up as you're going through international relations, as you're learning more about this. And I was actually working on another project looking at strategists, scholars, policymakers, and how they thought about nuclear strategy, and what the relationships were over time. And what struck me is how almost all of these wizards of Armageddon or blind oracles, whatever different phrase you want to use, different authors, they were always focused on conflict between two nuclear states, strategy between two nuclear states. And it's not surprising when you think about when a lot of this work was done. It originated during the Cold War, when the focus was understandably on the superpower standoff, but even after the Cold War. Attention continued to be on situations when both sides have them, think India and Pakistan, tensions there, or non-proliferation more broadly. And there was just much less attention to, well, what about these cases where there's fights and only one side has them and the other side doesn't? Not nothing, but I didn't find any good sustained treatment, and so I sought out to try to answer that puzzle. Because it was a puzzle to me. It was a puzzle to me for a few reasons. Conflict in what I call nuclear monopoly in the book. It's a puzzle because if this is the absolute weapon, as Bernard Brodie put it in one of the first attempts to deal with what are the implications of these weapons for international politics. If they can do this incredible damage to societies in under an hour, why is it that states that don't have ability to deter these strikes seem to get into fights with countries that have them anyway? And it's puzzling because this is actually kind of common. There's been at least 16 wars between states with nuclear weapons and states that don't have them, and then you look at how these are coded, different things, but the underlying dispute gets started by the non-nuclear state about half the time. So the core question I want to answer or grapple with is, why do states without nuclear weapons get into fights with countries that have them? And the simple answer, some of you may just be saying, well, nobody thinks they're going to be used. Fair enough. I found that unsatisfying because it doesn't tell us why people wouldn't think they'd be used. Why would most weapons, when they're invented, get used and then keep getting used? Right? And also, do all non-nuclear state leaders, or do all leaders in countries without nuclear weapons think this way? Do some but not others? Does the same person think differently over time? What accounts for that variation? I think answering those questions matter if we're going to explain the role of nuclear weapons in conflict and hopefully work to prevent them from being used again. So my basic claim: conventionally weak non-nuclear states can raise political and strategic costs or lower the benefits of their opponent using nuclear weapons. In essence, they are identifying their own red lines and gambling that if they can walk up to but not cross those, they won't invite nuclear retaliation. So it's a cost-benefits argument. Number of costs to using nuclear weapons for the nuclear state: obviously kills a lot of people, destroys other objectives the state may be interested in, can harm friendly neutral states. diplomatic pushback, and the non-nuclear state can leverage some of these costs. It can seek out third parties to try to restrain the nuclear arms state. It can try to leverage non-use norms that have evolved over time to put diplomatic pressure on the state. But as the danger to the nuclear weapon state increases, at some point the benefits of use will outweigh the costs. And so non-nuclear weapon states have to take this into account as well. And most importantly, I argue, they can limit the way they prosecute the conflict. They can fight in a way that doesn't pose a very large danger to the nuclear opponent. They still try to obtain their political objectives. And that focus on the scope of danger means I pay a lot of attention to the conventional balance as well. These two interact quite a lot. So in general, the more conventionally powerful the non-nuclear weapon state is relative to the opponent, the more restrained it will have to be, to the extent that we should not see wars between conventionally powerful non-nuclear weapon states and similarly situated nuclear weapon states, because that poses a much larger danger to the nuclear state and invites nuclear retaliation. So that's the basic argument. As a political scientist, I then go try to find evidence, and as a political scientist, I find evidence that supports my argument. And it comes from a few places. One is the basic pattern of conflict. You just look at the fights, they've always been between countries with vast asymmetries in conventional power in favor of the nuclear arms state. And the nuclear arms state has never really faced a serious prospect of devastation or destruction. I can talk about Israel, Egypt, because it is one of the cases that I looked at in detail. So I look at all the wars, but I also look in depth at 4 cases: Iraqi decision-making in the Gulf War, Egyptian decision-making in the 1969 and 1973 wars, Chinese decision-making in the Korean War, and then the Taiwan Straits crises throughout the 1950s. And then, because again, in political science, I need to have a negative case, so I look at Soviet decision-making, deciding not to escalate, not to fight during the Berlin blockade, when it was a true worldwide nuclear. So it should be clear, I'm focusing on what's going on in the capitals, the leaders, the people of the state without nuclear weapons. We have a lot of what's going on in the state with the nuclear weapons, not so much on the other side. Getting that material is not easy. Authoritarian regimes are not exactly open books. Nuclear strategy politics are shrouded in secrecy even among countries that don't have them. And there's incentives to misrepresent how much these matter to avoid appearing weak, or that they do matter, inviting efforts at atomic blackmail, as some leaders put it. So relying on a number of different sources to try to piece this together, primary sources wherever possible. The best set was for the Iraq case, actually. The United States, when it invaded in 2003, captured a large number of government documents. A subset of those, not just documents, but recordings, audio, video, a subset of those were made available to researchers for a time. Unfortunately, budget being what it is, the Pentagon couldn't afford $2 or $3 million for that set. It was more than that, but it closed. I was fortunate enough to get in there during the window was open. The Cold War International History Project, large number of documents on Soviet Union, Communist China. Egypt didn't have direct access to Cairo, but what I could do is look at what they were saying to leaders in other countries, in particular the United States. So there's a number of very candid conversations between Henry Kissinger and his Egyptian counterparts, and that gives you a sense of what their decision-making was. Can go through any of the cases. I just want to give you a sense of what one of them looks like. So I'll talk about the Iraq case in 1990. And from Baghdad's perspective, the situation in 1990, domestically, internationally, was bleak, and it was getting worse. And so Iraq attacked Kuwait to try to address these problems, or redress these problems, defend by attacking, as they put it at the time, and fully expecting some U.S. response. So the sort of myth of the green light, they did not interpret a green light from the U.S. ambassador, for those of you that are familiar with the case. And you would think that in 1990, after 45 years of not using nuclear weapons, after the United States not using them in Korea, not using them in Vietnam, Iraqi leaders might just not bring this up at all. But they did. And they did a lot in private, among themselves. To give you just one example, Izzat al-Duri, a member of the Revolutionary Command Council, said in October, quote, "It is possible that if the United States hits us and after 6 or 7 months did not get the result and saw that the war is going to start tearing the American people apart, it is possible that we'll use nuclear bombs to strike 2 or 3 cities." So no straight up cost-benefit logic. If U.S. losses mount, and the benefits of overcoming those costs will go up, and nuclear weapons use becomes more likely. Now, the Iraqi government did plan to inflict casualties. That was part of the basic strategy. They didn't just resign themselves to nuclear strikes, and we have a number of different sources we can look to. One comes from a speech draft from August 1990, so just days after the invasion. Outlines a number of reasons why the Iraqis believe the U.S. might be reluctant, provided they fight defensively and don't start expanding the conflict further. First, international opinion would turn against the United States. Second, they said the United States would not want to risk destroying oil fields. And third, with the document identified as the most important, quote, America knows that Iraq has weapons that can match their tactical weapons, and Iraq is able to respond to such usage by retaliating against their forces or retaliating against Israel. That's not nuclear weapons, that's almost certainly a reference to chemical weapons. Possibly biological, but almost certainly chemical. And this is a deterrent. It's not a first use. It's saying we will hold these in reserve to try to deter the Americans from using it, but to raise the cost on them if they were to think about using nuclear weapons. And they explicitly identified the U.S. nuclear arsenal as a reason to be cautious with their chemical weapons. At a meeting in November 1990, Tariq Aziz, who was the foreign minister, said using chemical weapons could, quote, give the Americans an excuse for a nuclear attack. So though, again, those of you familiar with the case, there's some sense that James Baker, Secretary of State, gave a veiled warning in January, and that influenced their decision making. They were already arguing among themselves, or to bring that up among themselves prior to that. They were taking those weapons into account without any explicit warning. And those discussions were not just empty rhetoric. They took a number of concrete steps. Iraqi military leaders said they based some deployment decisions of the Republican Guard based on analysis of what U.S. nuclear capabilities could do. Officials put in place costly civil defense procedures to hedge against possible U.S. nuclear use. They were explicitly considering the impact of a 20-kiloton nuclear bomb on the city of Baghdad. I do not know why they modeled the 20-kiloton blast, other than that is similar to what the yield was used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they actually did some evacuations from Baghdad, or from suburbs, trying to put in place these civil defense procedures. Multiple sources indicate Saddam Hussein put in place planning, command and control to only use chemical weapons in the event that either the United States used nuclear weapons or possibly invaded Baghdad. So the U.S. nuclear arsenal shaped Iraqi decision-making behavior, even if it didn't deter the initial attack, even if it didn't compel Iraq to leave Kuwait. So I'll just conclude then with a few implications. First, it's a mistake to dismiss these leaders in states confronting nuclear armed opponents as irrational or crazy. I don't find that. There's an underlying strategic logic that informs their decision-making that is consistent across a number of different leaders across different periods of history. Second, there's an ongoing debate, and this will not settle it, but an ongoing debate in strategic circles of how much is enough, how large, how sophisticated does your nuclear arsenal need to be. At least in the cases in this book, the answer is, I guess, somewhat optimistically, very few. So a case for maybe you don't need as many. Soviets, Chinese, Egyptians all faced what were by today's standards fairly rudimentary arsenals when they were confronting a nuclear opponent, and yet that influenced their decision making. And Iraq was not focused on massive nuclear arsenal, U.S. nuclear arsenal at the end of the Cold War, but on this possibility of just 2 or 3 strikes, right? Third, I'll make a pitch for history. I think historical lessons of nuclear politics are relevant for today. There's a tendency to talk about the first nuclear age and the second nuclear age, and there the two shall meet. Sharp dividing line, but that sort of bifurcation of the nuclear era only makes sense if you think that the first nuclear age was just about the Cold War standoff, and it never was. Countries were dealing with fighting, nuclear armed states were dealing with fighting non-nuclear armed states before and after the Cold War. Non-proliferation was a concern during and after the Cold War. These issues come back time and time again. So there's a lot to learn from the past to inform our thinking today. And finally, nuclear weapons cast a limited but definite shadow in these disputes. They're not all-encompassing, but they're not irrelevant. And they do provide benefits, or at least I think the evidence shows they provide some benefits to their possessors as a result of this. And that's an unsettling implication. It's not one that I expected to find when I started. But it is one that I think proponents of arms control, disarmament, need to take into consideration if we're going to make progress in those fields. So with that, I'll stop.
Great. Thanks a lot.